So, for the past few months I've been constantly hearing about how the ethnostate isn't viable and how civic nationalism is a much more viable alternative. Well, recently, after watching the debate between Fuentes and RC Maxwell, I decided to make a video about why basing this state on something biological, like race, is more stable than basing it on something ideological or philosophical. In the current year, there are two main states being argued for. There is the ethnostate and there is the civic state. The civic state is based on ideology, a set of principles, while a ethnostate is based on ethnicity or race. The two main contrasts I see between these two states is one of these is based on something innate, unchangeable, and persistent across generations, and the other state is based on something which can be argued for and changed, and might not actually be inherited by the next generation. This is why I tend to go with an ethnostate, because an ethnostate is based on something stable, something tangible and real. It's an objective measurement of citizenship. If you have these genes, you are a citizen of this state. I think this is a better founding principle for a state because it's measurable and it can't be undermined or debated. Over time, this founding principle will not change. It is stable. So while there may be ideological disagreements, all the people there still share something that is objective. So 300 years after an ethnostate is formed, the population is still largely the same. The only thing that's changed is the ideas in their heads. And from the founding of the state, the ideas may be less homogeneous, or they might be more homogeneous. Either way, you've still got something at the core of the state which is objective and persistent. This is my problem with the civic state, is if you found a civic state and you don't have anything objective at the heart of it, you've only got philosophy or principles. As time passes by, philosophies and principles in both states will change. There's no avoiding it. The problem is that in the civic state, every time there's an ideological tension, you risk having it break out amongst racial lines as well, as we have seen occur. For example, in the United States, the left-right divide is very much racial when it comes to groups like blacks. There's very few conservative blacks. They are firmly and tribalistically stuck on the side of the left wing. This is true for most minorities in the United States. As soon as there was an ideological disagreement, everyone began to realize political beliefs actually strongly correlate with what race you happen to be. In a civic state, there's no defense against this. Changes and injustices will inevitably begin to show themselves along racial lines. Africans simply aren't as smart as Japanese people. If you have a Japanese and an African minority in your civic state, there's going to be inequalities between them, and people are going to notice that these inequalities break down amongst racial lines. When they realize that these inequalities break down amongst racial lines, they're going to start becoming more tribalistic, and there's nothing you can really do to stop them from changing their ideologies to suit what's best for their group. So as time goes by in a civic state, ideas can very easily become much more weak and far less objective. To contrast this with the ethnostate, the thing that holds the state together is the genetics of the people, the racial group. With time, no matter how much you disagree with each other ideologically, the foundational idea of the state isn't actually going to be targeted. All the fighting is going to happen around the periphery of the government rather than the core tenets. And this is the worst case scenario for the ethnostate if there is large ideological divides. There's no reason why people in the ethnostate, since they're genetically similar, if there was any world in which a group was going to come to similar agreements ideologically, it would be in the ethnostate. These people are primed with the same ancestry, the same heritage, the same genetics. They'd all be raised in the same state, they'd all have similar environments, they would all fit into the same range of economics. While people would obviously differ in their economic status, they would all still be within a certain bracket in contrast to the rest of the world. An ethnostate, everyone would just have far more in common with each other. And as RC Maxwell said in his debate against Fuentes, that difference inevitably leads to conflict. So I don't see why you would want to base your state on something that is fundamentally open to disagreement, whereas I want to base my state on something that is objectively measurable and can't be debated. What makes up an English person in the English ethnostate is a certain set of genes that we can easily identify. This argument that people keep coming out with, the what is white argument, is a completely bullshit argument, and I think I'm eventually going to have to make a video explaining how easy it is to tell when a person belongs to the white group as a whole and when they belong to each subgroup within white as a group. It's incredibly easy to tell the difference between a Finn and a Englishman genetically. It's even easy to tell the difference between a Scot and an Englishman, or an Irishman and a Scotsman. This idea that we can't use this as an objective measure because we have no agreement on whether Slavs are white is complete and utter horse shit. No person with a working brain thinks that Slavs aren't white. They might think Slavs are mainly white with a small bit of Asian admixture, but everyone agrees that Slavs are white. Everyone agrees that the English are different from the Scots. Everyone agrees that the Swedes are different from the Finns. We can easily identify these different groups, so it's easy to base a government on these easily distinguishable features, and the people within the states will be able to tell who is a member of their state, and the people from outside of the states will be able to tell who belongs to which state. When it comes to civic nationalism, there is no easy way to identify who a member of your state is. There's no way to know whether their thoughts are in alignment with the fundamental principles that form the state. Every criticism that people are making of the ethnostate can easily be turned against the civic state. When they ask, what's white? Then you ask them, what's liberal? And then you say, what's liberal going to be in 100 years from now? How are you going to make sure it's persistent across centuries? Because what makes an Englishman English and what makes a Swede Swedish isn't going to change. They're going to persist. England has always been English for millennia, but England wasn't always democratic. That's a very new development. England didn't always have feudalism. That was a development that came and went. These states are fundamentally unstable and there's nothing stopping them from being blown down. Hopefully that will work in our favour when we try to blow over the current states in favour of states that are more suitable to our people. Anyone that tries to tell you that the ethnostate is an unstable idea or that it's not realistic is simply ignoring reality, and they must be purposely ignoring history. For millennia, Europe was a series of ethnostates, and while there was conflict within these states and between them, most of these disagreements weren't actually caused by straight up racism or ethnic nationalism. They were almost always boiled down to some form of greed or ideological difference. The problem is that once you have those ideological differences, they do eventually boil down to racial lines. The example that was used in the Fuentes vs. Maxwell debate was the First World War, and Maxwell kept saying that this was triggered by the assassination of the Archduke of Austria, and said that the motivation for this assassination was ethno-nationalism, and Fuentes denied this by saying that if multiculturalism wasn't being forced on them, the assassination would have never taken place. It's simply just what comes first, the chicken or the egg. Is the nationalist at fault for attacking the person who is forcing multiculturalism on them? Or is the multiculturalist at fault for aggressing against the nationalist by flooding his home with foreign people? If you have any concept of democracy or the people having some control over their country, then you can't be in favour of policies by the elite to flood the country with foreigners. The answer to the question is simply whether you think it's alright to invite people without consulting the citizenry first. If you think it's alright to invite people without consulting the public, then you're going to say that it was the nationalists' fault for starting World War I. But if you're a nationalist and you think the people should be consulted before multiculturalism is imposed against them, then you're going to say that the nationalists weren't at fault and that the person forcing multiculturalism was the one aggressing against them. So by basing your state on race, you've already put something solid at the foundation, and now the only thing you have to work on is getting the people to agree with each other. Whereas if you put civics at the center of your state, you've already put the conflict at the heart of the state. I think it's time we turn the tables on people who advocate for a civic state. There's no reason why we should have to sit here and explain why our state is viable. It's been proven to be viable for millennia. They are the ones that are coming up with a new idea, and they are the ones that are asserting that something will work that has never been tested. So they are the ones that should be getting questioned, and they are the ones that should be providing justification. Yeah, that's all I really have to say. Like the video, subscribe, send the video to any idiot leftist who tries to tell you that the ethnostate isn't viable. It's their state that isn't viable, and it's time they started justifying the existence of their state. We have history on our side.